Important aspect of the spread of English is the colonial language policy. Colonial language policy was based on the authority of the colonial powers and their will to impose their own policies on the people they are subjugated. We observe now that even though these nations have been freed, the subjugation of these nations has continued. And the imperial powers still exert their power in different ways. For example, through the popularity of their culture or the exertion of economic power that they exercise over the entire world. So we see that although we do not have colonies anymore and these nations have freed themselves, but the power or the control of the West has continued over these nations. Colonial language policy during colonization focused only on the imperial powers, and the accounts of the policies of the colonial powers that we read now, they all seem to focus on the imperial powers. And the role of speech communities in language planning is completely overlooked. Although we see that when we look at history, we see that many of these policies were reactive and they were formulated in reaction to the actions of different speech communities. Although this aspect of the role of speech communities in the formulation of policies is completely overlooked by many writers, and especially in the top-down approach of language policy and planning, where the power of planning or the authority to determine policy and planning vis-a-vis a language rests only with the more powerful or the people who have more control and authority. We see that the indigenous populations played a very important role in the development of world Englishes through the role that they played in the shaping of language policies during those times. So in this way, the imperial language policy was not unidirectional at all, because the indigenous population contributed to the formulation of these policies in many ways. As we just said, that many of these policies were formulated in reaction to what speech communities were doing or demanding. So it was a response to the actions of the local population, who made certain demands on the colonial administration through their actions. Their actions were such that they made it necessary for the colonial powers to design certain policies vis-a-vis language. And then English was used as part of the anti-colonial struggle. Instead of being put down by the use of English, the subjugated people realized that their freedom was possible only when they became well versed in English. And the spread of English in this way is a result of this struggle against imperialism. Although the top-down approach looks at the spread of English as an outcome of imperialism and as a result of the policies which were implemented by the imperial powers, we see that the spread of English is as much a result of anti-imperial activities and anti-imperial struggles as it is a result of imperialism, because of the taking up of the language or because of this strategy of using English for anti-colonial struggle by several indigenous populations. So this containment policy that the British adopted in the parts where the parts which it colonized. This containment policy of restricting English to certain circles only was a response to the inclusion of English to the anti-colonial struggle. So when they realized that the use of English was taking place to fight imperialism or to struggle against imperialism, they implemented certain policies which were meant to contain the learning of English. So this policy of containing the learning of English or restricting it to certain classes only was not a policy initiated by the British, but a policy which was made necessary because of the use of English for the carrying out of several anti-colonial struggles. So what we are trying to say here is that the spread of English was not only a result of the policies which were formulated by the colonial powers and imposed on the subjugated nations, that many of these policies were reactive in nature, and they were made to as a result of the actions of the indigenous populations. So in this way, the role that the indigenous populations played in the spread of English is as significant as the role of imperial powers.